unmuted myself. Okay, I think we can start now. Welcome to everyone who has joined us online for session number 2 of the PDD Data and Knowledge Working Group Virtual Marketplace. Some of you might have joined the first morning session today, and welcome you again to this second session. We have 5 fantastic presentations for this afternoon. I'm going to quickly introduce the first presentation will be made by Kara Siahaan from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Her presentation will focus on forecast-based financing and disaster displacement. This is linked to innovative approach to address impact of disaster displacement. She will be highlighting opportunities and challenges associated with utilizing forecast-based financing to reduce risk and address the humanitarian impact of disaster displacement. The second presentation will be by Julia Blocher and Kira Finke from Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, PIK. This is about bringing data and evidence to support policy. So the study in looking at human mobility in context of climate change, analyzing policy landscape and frameworks at both national and regional level. It's going to be super interesting. The third presentation coming after will be by Susanna Adamo from the Center for International Earth Science Information Network, Columbia University. It will be on migration, COVID-19 pandemic, and climate in Central America's Northern Triangle. As we all aware, 2020 is the year of lessons learned for all of us. So this is going to look at impacts of the compound risk of climate impacts and COVID-19 pandemic on current trends and future scenario of climate-induced migration in Central America, specifically Northern Triangle region. Next will be Damian Jusselm from the Displacement Tracking Matrix at IOM. He will present the complex yet very important aspect of transhumans mobility, looking into data collection to better understand changes in trends and patterns, as well as providing early warning system for transhumans events. And last but not least, Sylvain Poncer from IDMC will present on the estimation of disaster displacement stock. As we all know, IDMC for the first time has published stock on disaster displacement figures by the end of last year. So it would be very interesting to hear more from Sylvain, how this work has been done and where are the data gaps still persist. Now, before we start, there are a few rules as shown on the screen. First of all, this meeting is recorded and will be shared on the websites publicly. Please switch off your camera unless you're speaking, and try to make sure that you are muted at all times unless it's your turn to speak. You can use the raise hand function on the application to request to speak, or alternatively, you can write in the chat box if you want to speak, or if you have any questions to the particular presentation or in general to the panel. We will have a session of question and answer at the end of the presentation, and we will try to go through all these different questions. Without taking much more time, I'm going to pass the floor now to our first presenter, Kara, who will start her presentation. Over to you, Kara. I see this, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Did I repeat the intro? Okay. Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Kara Siaan. Greetings from Geneva. I work for the IFRC as the coordinator for early action and disaster risk financing. Um, and also I have another hat in which is the lead for
Your PowerPoint is off.
oh really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Tech issue.
It's coming back now. Yes.
Okay, great, super. So yes, I also lead the anticipation hub thematic areas on emerging topics, policy, and network. So I am actually stepping in very last minute today for my colleague Zeke Simperingham, who might be more familiar to you. He's our migration and displacement coordinator at IFRC. So I'll try my best to capture the points that he's trying to make through the recent issue briefs on forecast-based financing and disaster displacement. The brief was recently published. The title is Forecast-Based Financing and Disaster Displacement, Acting Early to Reduce the Humanitarian Impacts of Displacement. I also will introduce the link in the chat box later on. But before I continue talking about the brief, it would be good to also provide you with a short introduction on what is FBF. So if you're not already familiar with the approach with FBF, we are really trying to, let's say, shift the approach in the humanitarian sector from reaction to anticipation. So again, very brief, really easy questions that we ask ourselves. If we knew a flood was coming, why are we waiting to rescue people by boat instead of giving them the means to get out of the way? If a farmer knows that her seeds won't produce harvest due to an imminent drought, why don't we give her drought-resistant seeds instead of waiting for her family to starve and her children to show up malnourished in the clinic? So today, we know that we can predict with growing confidence the humanitarian impacts of certain climatic shocks and also communicable disease. In these cases,
sorry, Kara. I received in the chat some cannot hear you very well.
Oh, but can you hear me well?
I had to put my earphone to yeah.
Okay,
if you have
Is this better or worse?
Oh, much better.
Okay, I think it was just the volume. Okay, I'll continue. So again, the rationale behind promoting anticipatory action and forecast-based financing. So today we can predict with growing confidence in the humanitarian sector the impacts of certain climatic shocks and also communicable disease. In these cases, neither the shock nor the way the crisis unfolds should surprise us. So by using data, predictions, and forecasts, we can anticipate humanitarian needs and think through actions mitigate or prevent suffering before a crisis spirals out of control. So the next slide, can you still see my slide, Rizky?
Yes, I can see your slide, but it's not full screen. It's
yeah, okay, sorry for that. Okay, so the key elements for forecast-based financing are the three elements. So first is the trigger. It's about matching forecasts and risk. So exposure, impact, and vulnerability. This is about knowing where and when to act, and the selection of early actions. This is knowing what to do to reduce the humanitarian impacts, taking that opportunity between a forecast and a hazard impact to take action to mitigate the impact of a certain event. And of course, having the pre-agreed financing, how to finance, because this is normally what is difficult about acting early is it bad enough? Do we need to finance now or later? Do we need to wait? So having a pre-agreed financing mechanism that is now developed by different agencies. So we have the forecast-based action by Disaster Relief Emergency Fund. The SERV is also piloting now anticipatory action. We have other UN agencies having their agency-based mechanism. And for all of us, all of this is organized in what we call an early action protocol. So next slide. Can you see? So just very briefly, in the Red Cross, Red Crescent network, we are working in 31 countries at the moment, but we are also closely collaborating in many of those countries with UN partners and also the START network of INGOs. So altogether, we are covering 60 countries. So again, now back to the brief that Vic has authored and recently published. I will go over the points that he wants to make through the presentation. First of the 3 points, and I'm sure this is something that the group hopefully shares and resonates with many of us here. The first point is we want to look at the connection between SBF, forecast-based financing, and disaster and climate displacement. We need to first recognize that disaster and climate-related displacement itself is complex, it's diverse, and it's multifaceted. This is the point that I'm sure is well understood by many of us. What this means is that climate and disaster-related displacement can look very different in different regions. It can look very different between different countries, and can even look different within a country, depending not only on exposure to a specific hazard that is leading to displacement, but other factors that influence resilience and vulnerability, ranging from development to land use, to population growth, to urbanization, to marginalization and discrimination. For example, displacement connected to slow onset sea level rise and permanent loss of land in small island states, as we know, Kiribati and Tuvalu. The displacement we have recently witnessed connected to mega events such as floods and typhoons in Bangladesh, Philippines, Vietnam, and Mozambique. We also see displacement occurring where there is an intersection of hazard and conflict, such as the large-scale displacement following drought in Afghanistan. These can look very different. The duration of displacement may be very different. The location of displacement also may be very different in rural, urban, peri-urban locations, or in dispersed temporary shelters, camps with host communities, or in informal settlements and slums. So to demonstrate some of the diversity, the action of national societies, Red Cross, Red Crescent national societies, we have a new collection of case studies. It's not yet finalized, but hopefully very soon. The case studies include examples from the action taken by national societies in Nepal, Afghanistan, Vanuatu, Fiji, and the Philippines. And this is based very much on our work in Asia Pacific. However, we hope to develop similar cases from other regions as well. So the first point, again, that is very complex and diverse challenge that look at very different contexts and location, and there is not one type of climate or disaster displacement. The second point that we want to address on this challenge is we need to take a multi-sector and integrated approach. So this is, for me, the second webinar that I attended connected to the issue of linking displacement and forecast-based financing and anticipatory action. During summer, we also presented to the GP20. So we really are keen on trying to bridge and break the silos between the communities working on displacement and anticipatory action. So while humanitarian response important, of course, to address assistance and protection need, we recognize this is not enough doing it alone. So we need to better understand risk and impact through community-led assessment. We need to consider and utilize disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, as well as humanitarian response recovery to support durable solutions, and all combined and reinforced with an effective legal and policy framework. And on the point about legal frameworks, we have also, again, this is led by Zeke, a new brief on the role that disaster law can play in reducing risk and addressing displacement. I will also put the link in the chat box. And so again, just to reiterate that this complex and multifaceted issues where we need to take an integrated approach, the point of this report is, where does forecast-based financing fit in all of this? And does it and can it play an important role? So as mentioned earlier, anticipatory action is takes place before the humanitarian impact of a hazard has fully materialized. The objective of anticipatory action is protecting people against these impacts before they occur. Anticipatory action takes place in anticipation of specific predicted high probability and high impact shock upon issuance of a warning or activation of a trigger. And this report finds very clearly that this window, a precious window between a specific forecast and a hazard striking, is crucial window for minimizing risk and reducing the impacts of climate and disaster displacement. Demonstrate, for example, by a range of anticipatory action that we looked in this report, there are FPF initiatives to reinforce structures and protect livelihoods between a forecast and cyclones hitting in the Philippines. It may affect protecting people to remain in their house if it is safe and they choose also voluntarily to remain. In other words, protecting people and communities against forced displacement. These initiatives might also help to promote a faster return home and a return to normalcy after the hazard subsides. and so-called durable solution connected to a house that suffered, for example, less damage and less disruption to livelihoods. We also see FBF initiatives that facilitate evacuation of the most at-risk communities in Bangladesh, that can help make sure that if unavoidable displacement occurs, food, water, trained volunteers are in place in a timely manner to support a safe and dignified displacement pending the return home. Third and final point is that anticipatory action are already playing a very important role, but there are ways that we could jointly enhance the way we look specifically at disaster and climate displacement. This is something that we, and we hope many colleagues here also will continue to look at and support over the coming years. But some of the initial reactions and recommendations we have include, first, as part of the impact and risk assessment for anticipatory action approaches and forecast-based financing, is a focus on engaging and understanding the specific experience of people who have already been displaced in previous hazard and disasters. This should be emphasized in the design of anticipatory actions to be supported by forecast-based financing. This includes people who may otherwise be left behind, marginalized group refugees, migrants, and those who lack documents, those with insecure tenure, housing and land property rights, who also may be at risk, at most risk for the impacts of displacement and at the most risk of prolonged or protracted displacement. It's also important to recognize that the example of the lack of data on cross-border displacement does not necessarily mean that people are not crossing borders, but they may be doing so in irregular or undocumented manner and may not want to speak of this in any assessments. This point about the location of previous displacement or projected displacement. We also need to recognize that many people may be displaced to informal sites, not evacuation center, not camps, but they may live with relatives. They may not be counted in the assessment. They may even choose to leave the entire geographic region of the disasters. And so the third point and last point is that there is much that anticipatory action is doing and can be done through anticipatory action, but we, and again, I hope this includes many others today participating in this webinar to support and enhance focus on this aspect, really better minimize risk and address the impacts of displacement connected to disasters and climate change. I'm very cognizant that today we have a very short period to have a chat about this, and I also apologize that I have other commitments in 12 minutes, so I won't be able to attend the Q&A. However, I do want to, so I'm going to show the last slide, invite all of you. So if you want to have the continued discussions on the potentials and challenges to link anticipatory action for disaster displacement, we have the upcoming annual dialogue platform on anticipatory humanitarian action, where we normally annually gather in person nearly 300 people from the UN, the Red Cross, governments, and the academia. So Zeke and I, we will be supporting a session looking at the topic. So you can please join. The registration information is here, anticipation-hub.org, and you can also, very welcome to contact me. Thanks, and over to you, Rizky.
Thank you very much, Kara. It was interesting, and definitely we will need more time to go over more of the details of all these different things that you presented. Yes, and anyone on the line, feel free, as you saw, to get in touch with Kara later if you have any questions. Thanks so much again, Kara. I'm going to shift quickly now to the second presentation. This will be Julia and Kira from Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and thank you also to the organizers for putting this session up. I found the morning session to be very interesting and looking forward to continuing those discussions in this session. So my name is Julia Blocher. I'm a researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and I'm joined by my colleague Kira Finke, who is, I believe her video is on. You won't be hearing from her right now, but she will be taking questions later, and I hope also will specifically address questions related to our case studies in the Pacific, which is her area of expertise. And today I'm presenting some of the insights from a recent report that we published, which is called Homelands, island and archipelagic states policymaking for human mobility in the context of climate change. And I want to point out from the beginning that this is a report that we published with the German Development Agency, GIZ, and a number of co-authors from the regions concerned. So I saw in the chat that we have a couple of our colleagues from GIZ on the line, including our counterpart from the Philippines. So I do hope that also we may have the opportunity to hear from them if they have anything to add. This report is available online for free at www.adaptationcommunity.net. So the approach that we took for this study was really to establish a baseline of perceptions and opinions of policymakers and other stakeholders in the policymaking community in the 9 countries that we conducted research in. That includes Anguilla, Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, and St. Lucia in the Eastern Caribbean, as well as Fiji, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu in the Pacific. And also in the Western Pacific, we conducted research in the Philippines. So as compared to the morning session, in which I heard a lot about ongoing research, this is a study that is completed and already available, but is part of a larger project within GIZ. Just to give you a bit of an overview of our approach and methods, we conducted semi-structured interviews in these 9 countries and included, in fact, the questionnaire and annex in the report if you would like to take a look. We spoke with 94 stakeholders across the 3 regions with a pretty equal spread among the 3. And then we also employed focus group discussion methods in order to target specific topics of relevance to our research question. We then analyzed all of our interview data through a qualitative coding methods using available qualitative coding software. We tried to, as much as possible, have a good diversity of opinions and perceptions in our research approach, which is why we spoke to a number of different types of actors, not just from ministries and central governing bodies, although that was the majority of the people that we spoke to, but we also spoke with academics and people in the private sector, from NGOs and so on. So you can see in this pie graph on the bottom left, the roughly the spread of the type of people that we spoke to in this research. And I wanted to just give you a quick snapshot of, after speaking to these policymakers and other actors in the stakeholder community, their understanding of the knowledge of climate impacts in their countries. And we found quite a lot of expertise in that area. And surprisingly, considering the diversity of the countries that we were studying, that there's some common challenges that arose again and again within our interviews. Common challenges such as water security and land availability. And some of these challenges are specific to island archipelagic areas as well as coastal areas, such as saltwater intrusion and king tides and other biophysical issues. But we also found that when it comes to policy making, there was some common experiences that people kept raising again and again, such as recent experiences with superstorms and other types of natural hazard induced disasters that really motivated additional discussions on disaster displacement and policy making for disaster displacement, as well as taking sort of a step back, the overall issue of climate change and how climate change is affecting their countries. Now, I wanted to give you a quick snapshot of some of the insights from each of the regions that we studied, but of course, in the time allotted, I wouldn't be able to cover everything that we have in the report. So just to give a couple of really top line ideas from each region. In the Pacific, we found that a lot of the policymakers perceive that they're really at a crossroads at this moment. Some of the countries, as you know, are already in the process of developing specific legislation on planned relocations or on disaster displacement. Others are in different stages of developing such instruments, but many of them raise the issue of the need to begin planning for the future as opposing the opinion of local people who are truly attached to their land and are not interested in relocating, at least not yet. So one quote that I put here as a illustration of this, I had a policymaker who suggested that there's a need to have the voices of those people who are threatened by climate change heard, who need to move, but it's difficult to capture their input because they're unwilling to be relocated. They're attached to their land as a big part of their identity, and it gives them a sense of belonging. So although policymakers in this region very much want to begin to plan in a lot of cases, they also have to consider the opinions and willingness of their local people. We also in the Pacific discussed quite a lot with policymakers about how will they go forward with their planned relocations and success stories that they are looking to in the past, as well as lessons learned from less successful relocation opportunities. In the Philippines, although we looked at many different elements there, one thing that we very much focused on was institutional structures for dealing with disaster displacement as well as climate change adaptation, and how these two topics are either interlinked or may benefit from greater strengthening of linkages between them. In the Philippines, we heard that climate change migration is not really fully implemented in legal and policy frameworks yet, although there is a lot of movement in different elements of the government. It's mostly a little bit ad hoc at the moment, and there's a strong separation between actors that are working in climate change adaptation and those that are working in addressing displacement and disaster management. We found a few entry points that we highlight in the report where this issue of disaster displacement can be further addressed and also progress in the future. In the Eastern Caribbean, we have found an interesting dynamic between policymakers there that since this cyclone season of 2017, the issue of climate change in general has become more and more addressed and raised in high-level discussions, but yet there is need for further strengthening of instruments towards this. Dominica has developed a relocation strategy, but in the region in general, there's still limited national or regional coordination, as well as national regional cooperation on data collection, for example. And even though in the region there is partial freedom of movement, there's some gaps when it comes to data collection and data management that we can also discuss in the Q&A a bit more. Finally, I wanted to note some of the common data and knowledge challenges that we found in all of the regions of study. In particular, the barriers to coordination and exchange between and within ministries in a lot of cases. This disconnect that between political level as well as the more technical level, and also with local actors, including local government actors and local universities. We heard a lot about limits to technical capacities and also funding for technical experts who can look at disaster data and improve on disaster data. We also noticed a number of data collection gaps that exist and areas where there's a need for improvement, especially in disaggregating data by gender, by sex and by age. Some of our interviewees also really noted a lack of actionable research on the linkages between climate change and displacement or migration. So even if there is a bit of a body of research out there, it's not necessarily clear how they can use that as a foundation for a policy process. And then on a more logistical level, we found some issues in terms of knowledge management and the ability of actors in the field to exchange and share knowledge. So in the overall recommendation section in the report, we tried to bring together or offer some recommendations that are relevant to all of the countries of study. First of all, that setting a strategic direction is important, knowing what type of instrument they're hoping to develop, what type of data they're hoping to develop, and then setting a plan towards that. We also suggest, of course, that if countries are not mitigating climate change in general, working towards better management of disaster displacement would be like Sisyphus pushing a boulder up the hill. So it's important also to be engaged in regional discussions, international discussions around climate change mitigation and adaptation. We also offered a number of suggestions for improving data and research, as I just mentioned in the last slide. We suggest that effective policy implementation and decision-making should be fostered at multiple levels, including also local government actors. And then finally, we suggested widening and deepening the stakeholder networks in these countries, including not just the central decision-making bodies, but also NGOs and more local academic and technical experts. I think that would be it from me for now. So I very much look forward to your questions. And again, my colleague Kira Finke, who's the lead author on the report, is also on the line to take your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. It's fascinating. I myself, I have a few questions that, but I'm gonna wait until the end of the presentations. I guess I'm sure everyone else have some questions as well. I'm going to move quickly now to the third presenter, Susana Adamo from the Center for International Earth Science Information Network, Columbia University. She's going to talk about migration, pandemic, and climate in Central America. It's going to be interesting to hear. Over to you, Susana.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you to the PDD, the organizers, and the Data Knowledge Working Group for this session. It has been fascinating so far. This is a different presentation if you want, because this is a project that has not yet started. We are hoping to start this project, actually working on this on January 2021, but we wanted to present what we think we can do about this topic. This is a team, it's an interdisciplinary team between demographers and agricultural experts, climatologists, and it's composed of myself, Angel Munoz, Diego Pons, Diana Giraldo, Alex de Chervenin, Carmen Gonzalez from Columbia University, Colorado State, University of Reading. And the main objective that we had, the aim is to look into the observed and expected impact of the compound risk of climate impacts and climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic on both the current trends and the near-term future scenarios of climate-induced migration in Central America, Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. This is an area that has been studied regarding the impacts of climate and climate change. And we wanted to know what is the component effect, what happened when on top of it you have the COVID-19 pandemic that has been so hard in terms of mobility, all types of mobility. And our hypothesis is that the COVID-19 pandemic is actually changing the pathways in the Northern Triangle of Central America. And this has effects like multiplicative effects on the areas of origin and destination. Because it's enhancing the population vulnerability. And one way that we would like to in research is increase food insecurity. And we are trying to do this with a mixed methods approach based on diagnostic and predictive modeling and qualitative comparative analysis. So the antecedents that we have, as I said, these are the three triangles in the northern Central America, and we have this idea about the trouble teleconnection because both climate, migration, and pandemic, they're global in terms of their extension, but they are also very local in terms of the impact. The way that the three global processes combine in any particular place and time is very, very specific and very context specific. So I will mention the climate and migration in North Triangle has been studied. There is evidence of the impacts of climate on migration, internal and international migration. And we wanted to build on that research and continue this research. There is also mountain research and data on the disruptive impact of COVID-19 on mobility. And we wanted to know, to what extent these particular effects are affecting climate-related mobility. Is enhancing it, is reducing it, is how exactly it's impacted. And then there's also this other relation between climate and COVID-19 and how there is some research and some evidence that climate is related to COVID-19, both that COVID-19 is changing some of the metrics regarding to climate change, but also how climate condition could affect the impact of COVID-19. So we are also looking into that. And this is, of course, building in previous research. So you have here on the right are the projected climate migration, internal climate migration under 3 different scenarios between 2020 and 2050 for El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And this data is coming from the Groundswell project led by the World Bank. And then on the right, this is a research that is being led by Angel Munoz and IRI, and looking into what is the climate signal in the migration, international migration from Guatemala to the United States, and trying to piece out what is the effect of the different elements from the food price, infant mortality, coffee price, acute malnutrition, and also then the characteristic of precipitation in the area and the different trends that you can get from that. The question that we wanted to answer are, so how, and this means through what specific pathway do climate events influence migration behavior, and this means staying, living, returning, and we would like to see, if possible, to the sending, transit, and receiving areas in urban and rural characteristics, and what are the multiplicative effect that it has in addition to the initial impact that you can have. So in addition to initiating the movement, what are the effects after this started? On top of that, we want to know how are the multiple and very diverse impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic in origin and destination likely to alter those pathways. So you have an established pathway, how is COVID-19 effects affecting that particular pathway? And then, of course, the consequence question is how, or if you have this impact of COVID-19, how that is affecting the efficacy of internal and international migration as an adaptation strategy to climate hazards, and how the inclusion of COVID-19 then it's possible that could modify the future scenarios of climate migration, and how those potential differences vary across different contexts, internal, international, and so on. We have a research strategy that is starting with the data discovery, assessment, and acquisition. There's a lot of data on COVID-19, but we don't know how much of that data is good, what are the qualities. So there is a lot of data and what is appropriate for what we want to do. Then we are going to be using diagnostic modeling work, exploring the prediction of climate migration and also the modeling of the near-term future scenarios of climate migration. And then we want to explore the potential of qualitative comparative analysis for 3 outcomes of interest: the identification and description of climate migration pathway, the identification of the possible disruption due to COVID-19, and what are the patterns of exposure and vulnerability of migrant population in internal, international, and urban and rural. So the first step, the data discovery, assessment, acquisition, we are starting for what is already available, and we have certain sources that are common. So the climate data is coming from the International Research Institute for Climate and Society Data Library. That is very complete. So they have all the possible climate data that we need in and also tools to actually use that data and manipulate and build on that data. Then we have data on internal and international migration that from several sources. From international migration, we have the migratory survey of the northern and southern frontier, that is the MIF, that is led by the Colegio of de la Frontera Norte in Mexico, and then also data from Customs and Border Protection. apprehension data from the United States State Department. And then we have the internal migration flows between municipalities, the internal migration from the Latin American internal migration database for Latin America and the Caribbean, or MIALC. And then also we have some information on migrants in the counties in the United States from the American Community Survey. The environmental migration data portals are going to be critical in order to start exploring the data, qualitative data, particularly use cases, case studies on climate migration. Those include the IOM's environmental migration portal, the CLIMIC database, the PERN e-library, and this is just three. There are more of those, but these are the ones that concentrate a lot of the literature, not only the peer review, but also the great literature on climate migration, environmental migration in general. And then we have the data on COVID-19 impact on mobility. That's coming from a number of different sources. And this is where we want to concentrate the assessments to know what data is actually useful for our project. That includes the Migration Policy Institute that has the Migration Data Hub that has a page dedicated to COVID, the IOM's COVID-19 analytical snapshots, the Migration Data portal also. There's a new data that we want to explore that is the Google COVID-19 Aggregated Mobility Research Database. We already know that has information for Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. We don't know what is the granularity of the data and how it's going to continue in the future about this data, how long it's going to be available. And then we have also remittances data, a monthly level from the central banks, in addition to the annual remittance data from the World Bank. And then also there are local surveys, and this is critical. One of our partners is the monitoring surveys on the implication of the COVID-19 pandemic on farming families. And this is a project from ZGR, Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security Research Program. And that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Susana, for that presentation. I think we'll keep the questions after, and I'm going to move quickly now to my colleague Damian Giselle to present the transhumans tracking tool. Over to you, Damian.
Thank you, Risky. You can see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So let's start. So greetings from Dakar. I'm glad to be here with you today. I'll give you a short tour of a tool that we developed within the DTM team here, meant to monitor transhumance movements and prevent some of the potential conflicts between farmers and herders, which are increasingly nowadays linked with the climate change and climate variabilities that usually create this more and more frequent interface between farmers and herders in the same lands. Just to give a quick introduction on transhumance. Transhumance is a seasonal movement of livestock from one point to another in usually search of pastures and water points. Cattle are, of course, accompanied by herders and their families. The transhumance movements that you see in the region, particularly here in West and Central Africa, are generally characterized by cross-border movements or internal movements in the same country. Those movements are cyclical and usually following a north to south axis in periods that are usually quite set on the geography and the season. Whether it's the dry or the wet season, you usually have the same up and down movements. In Western Central Africa, the transhumance pastoralism involves a fairly large number of individuals, about 20 million persons at least, and many more animals. And it's one of the main source of meat for the region. Transhumance is an important economic activity and a driver of regional development. Climatic variability, demographic pressure, growing competition over resources that are rarer and rarer, political volatility and insecurity have all affected transhumance routes patterns and flows in the last few decades. The central transhumance corridor, which basically links all the Sahelian countries to the coastal countries, I'll show you a map later. This corridor has been particularly affected by those changes, resulting usually in fairly recurrent conflict between herders and farmers. Interestingly as well, the COVID-19 and the subsequent mobility restrictions that have been imposed by countries have also had an impact on the movements of transhumance herders and their cattle. So with all this in mind, we developed a tool that we wanted to be used to kind of provide reliable statistical data on flows, and especially as well on getting a better understanding of the farmers, herders conflicts in those areas. We've used a fairly standard displacement tracking matrix methodologies, which is the tool IOM uses to usually estimate flows or population displacements. And so we developed basically 4 tools used either together or separately. One is a mobility mapping, another one is a flow counting, a third one is an early warning system, and a fourth one is the individual surveys that we do. I'll go through more specifically the first 3 tools that I think are the most interesting for us right now. We have implemented, and we're still implementing, these kind of activities in quite a large areas of the regions. And you see here on the map, there's a large activity in Mauritania looking at those flows. There's also a large activity in the Liptako-Gourma area, which is the Mali, Niger, Burkina region. There's another one in almost the Lake Chad Basin, a little bit southern, between Cameroon, Chad, and Central Africa. And there's a much larger one nowadays looking at these Sahelian and coastal countries flows, basically between Mali and Niger and Côte d'Ivoire and Benin. So the first tool that we use is this mapping. It's very similar to what we do in DTM when we estimate displacement stocks, which means that we use key informants at local level, and we identify with them and estimate with them the stocks of herders and their cattle that are currently staying in those areas. We might, like you might tell me basically that this might be a bit difficult considering that they are usually moving. But when you usually look at transhumant trajectories, they have key spots usually where they stop in grazing lands or in water spots, water points. And so those are basically the areas where we tend to kind of do those type of mapping. And that gives us basically, by doing this exercise in fairly extended regions, this will give us key interesting data on the presence of some of these cattle and their herders in the areas that you can see here on the map. This is especially important now because with the COVID, a lot of the cattle have actually been stranded, if you want, along those borders, unable to move back where they were supposed to move up during the summer. A lot of the cattle we find are now stranded basically in the coastal areas of those countries like Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Benin, Togo, unable basically to move up because of the still ongoing mobility restrictions that you see there. So that's one tool. We have a second tool that we would apply in more, let's say, normal circumstances. This is a tool that we initially deployed in the region on migration movement, and we call it there the flow monitoring points. It's a tool basically that allows us to have to create a vision, a better understanding of some of the flows happening in some of the key transit areas in the region. We adapted this tool to look only at herders and their cattle in key gathering locations for them, water points being the main one, grazing lands, key big grazing lands being the second one. And also, of course, adapted to key periods during the transhumance. There is a clear moment when most of the animals and their herders are going down, a clear moment when people are going up. So we put usually enumerators in those locations, and basically they count simply the movements and ask some questions on the origins and the destination. This gives us usually key information on the number of animals and herders moving between the borders of the region. Both tools, the mapping and the counting, they are quite important in the region because the region relies on this transhumance quite a lot for a lot of the meat production, as I was saying. So there's quite a lot at stake in this in this transhumance. States keep a close eye usually on this movement and decide on quotas, allowing a certain number of animals basically to cross these borders. And these quotas are usually not really well estimated by the states and by the region. And that leads in turn to a lack of preparation of grazing areas and this lack of maintenance also of transhumance corridors that can then present a challenge to farmers and herders. So these tools usually provide decision makers in the region and those working on regulating a little bit transhumance. It provides useful data for them, at least useful estimates. The final tool that we deployed in this TTT transhumance tracking tool is an early warning system. It's slightly different than the first tool. It's a very localized early warning system. It's using a wide network of key informants that are living usually in those local communities and that are basically identifying potential factors of conflict. We identified with the support of a regional network of herders the main conflict-prone areas in the region for herders during usually their transhumance. Those conflicts usually occurs in these areas because of tensions basically between herders and farmers over resources, grazing land or water. And it takes place usually this conflict when herders arrive too early in the season and that the land have not been harvested or because the cattle is too voluminous for the area to absorb such a high demand. And this early movement or these massive movements are more and more basically one of the impacts of the climate change that we see here. And that leads then to conflict and then to displacement in these areas. I'm gonna stop here. This is one of the results of the early warning system. It shows a little bit of what type of alerts that we received in those very localized areas. This is more useful for the local communities. Actually, this is something that is being used at local level to kind of prevent conflict or deal with conflict when they arise. One last thing I would say is that I'll stop here. I'm happy to take any question at the end, but if you want to hear a bit more about this topic, we have actually a DTM brief tomorrow that is a bit longer for an hour, and that will go through a bit more the methodology of this work. But overall, yes, I think it's a useful tool to kind of reflect on one key population that is currently affected by climate change, which are the herders and their cattle. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Damien. Also interesting presentation. I'm going to, very conscious of time, I'm going to go straight to Sylvain to present the work around estimates stop for disaster, displacement caused by disaster. Over to you, Sylvain.
Thank you. You can hear me, correct?
Yes.
Thank you, Risky, and thank you for giving the opportunity of IDMC to present the work today at this data and knowledge working group regarding how we estimate the stock regarding disasters in 2019. As you may know, a month ago in Philippines, Typhoon Goni displaced around 2 million people. And a few days after, the majority of the people returned to their homes after these life-saving preemptive evacuations. However, the data that we collected in IDMC and the data that the government of Philippines collected and we monitor in IDMC discovered that 3 weeks after, there is at least 85,000 people that are still living in a situation of displacement after this event. And it's a question that we're asking ourselves, for how long they will remain displaced and why they will remain displaced. And thanks also for Damien for being like an icebreaker, getting the jargon that we use in IDMC to monitor internal displacement, regarding flows and stock. Regarding disasters displacement, we have in IDMC in our mandate to try to estimate the number of people internally displaced. It's like the forced people that have been obliged to leave their homes due to conflict or disaster situation, but they are mainly talking about disaster situation. And regarding movement and flows, it's fairly easy for us to collect information. However, for the outflow, like the return flow, there is almost no information regarding disaster displacement, regarding like returns. Regarding stock, we have some snapshot about people living in station of displacement, but this is like very not very detailed over time. This is what normally we call our time series data. This is the gold mine for us to estimate the stock. However, since now 3 years, IDMC tried to collect systematically housing destruction. This is a very good proxy for us to estimate displacement and to understand the medium to the long-term displacement. In IDMC in 2019, we were able with the team to detect more than 1,900 disasters events that have triggered displacement in 148 countries and territories. And from this almost 2,000 disasters events, we collect in our database more than 11,000 pieces of information or evidence of situation of displacement. And of course, it includes housing destructions. Just to give you like an overview, regarding the 1,900 events, 50% of these events have triggers housing destructions. It's like enormous. This is like the metrics that we are reporting every year in our global report. Last year, 3/4 of the total displacement were due to disasters and 95% by weather-related events. And last year, for the first time, IDMC combined the stock with the conflict ones. Normally, since IDMC is collecting data on displacement, we give, at the end of the year, normally only the number of people that are still living in a situation of displacement due to conflict. And last year, with the evidence that we found, and this is something that I will present right now, we were able to combine the two. Of course, you will see that the 5.1 million could sound very conservative compared to the conflict, but I will explain why. When we monitor, as I said in my previous slide, there is like many data gaps that are challenging for us. One of them is, of course, from where to where the people have been displaced. Is they are crossing borders, etc. This is sometimes like a question for us. Of course, the disaggregation of the data, the gender, the people behind that, the sex, the age, that remains mainly unknown for us. And of course, is the duration of the displacement, when the people return home. And this is the question that we ask ourselves in 2019 to see how we can come up with the challenge and propose the solutions. This is why we decided to look getting the evidence that we have collected around 2019 and see what the data is telling us. And to illustrate our time series, I'm giving the example of the earthquake that occurred in Maluku province in Indonesia. It was a 6.8 earthquake in end of September. And thanks to the government of Indonesia, they are collecting like very detailed data. And you can see that there is a time series data, like during 3 weeks after the disaster, we have like a very good collection of data, but we have a data gap between beginning of October until the 7th of December. There is something that we don't know. What happened to the 80,000 people between the dots in beginning of October and the 7th of December? And what happened to the people that are still living in a situation of displacement on the 7th of December? In IDMC, without further evidence, we assume that the people, the 2,500 people, remain displaced at the end of the year. If the government will collect data in 2020, telling us that all people return home, this can be removed from those stock. And of course, depending of the regions on the country, there is many factors that can intervene on regarding the ability of reconstruction and recovery. Of course, the insurance penetration, the urban planning, the coping capacity could really play a role there. And to try to give like an average length of the time that it will take to reconstruct a destroyed housing, we took the FEMA, they have like this ASUS, we took that and we estimate that globally, it will take approximately between 12 to 15 months for being able to return home. This is why now, when I will not go in details through all these different scenarios, but based on the evidence of the data that we collected in 2019, we use different kind of scenarios. And for the scenarios 1, for example, we have like evidence that there is still people living in a situation of displacement years after disasters happened. Like, for example, in Haiti, we know that there is 33,000 Haitians that are still living in a situation of displacement after the earthquake in 2010. Same in Bangladesh, we know that there is 60 people after a landslide following the TC Mora in 2017 that were living in a situation of displacement in 2019. And for the other scenarios, we developed kind of a decision rules to overcome the lack of harmonized data on displacement and housing destruction, across all the countries that we monitor. And at the end, we were able to come up with a number, and we, as I said at the beginning, is a very conservative one. There is at least 5.1 million people that were still living in a situation of displacement due to disasters in 2019. I will really encourage you, if you want to know more about how we calculate that and really look to the different scenarios, to go to our methodological annex that you can find on our global report web page that I'm happy to share that on the chat. But just to give you like an overview that displacement is happening everywhere, and there is still people living in situation of displacement at the end of the year. And it will be exactly the same in 2020. We will do again the same decision rules to estimate the number of people still living in situation of displacement at the end of 2020. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvain. That was very useful. All right, I think we are at the end of the presentations. We're going to open a question and answer session now. I'm trying to navigate the Zoom chat box to try to see if there has been any questions posted by the audience, but I don't think I see one. So still opening the floor for anyone. Either you have any question or to a specific presentation, or more of a general question to all the panelists. And let me know if I miss. I'm trying to go through the to scroll down this chat box. If I might have missed your question by any chance, please do post again there so I can read. Perhaps also, through the registration for this event, we collected some of the questions the colleagues who were planning to join the different sessions have to our different presenters. We look at some of those questions, and I intentionally pick a few of those that you have been asking. and we'll try to put these questions to get some thoughts and answers from some of our panelists here. Maybe to start with, there was one question about how we can ensure that the work that we're doing in terms of data collection or analysis or research take into consideration all the affected population, meaning that not only the displaced persons, but also, for example, especially host communities. Maybe I'll turn to Julia and Kira first, if they can speak a bit about this in relation to their work.
Yeah, I'm happy to give it a shot, and then maybe Julia can add to this. It's certainly an important question, and it adds to the fact of how to feed back the research results or study results to the communities also, so it doesn't just stay within universities, but also within the communities of practitioners and such. What we saw is that, and Julia has emphasized this already, that there is a lack of data on many levels, including on populations who are not able to move, or populations who are on the receiving end of receiving migrant or displaced persons in their homes, even in the Caribbean, in the case of the Caribbean, for example, where after large-scale displacements, people were housed in private homes for several months, but there's no real data on how this affected these host communities and how also it affected the people who were staying there. There are some good practices of trying to foster more regional collaborations, for example, in the Caribbean, that could be applied to other contexts. So we saw more regional frameworks being applied in the Caribbean than, for example, in the Pacific, but also there the geographical preconditions are very, very different, just from the scale of distances between the islands and such. We're talking about tremendously different scales. So yeah, I mean, for our part, the research results are being used by GIZ, and they are also feeding these back into different communities through their offices in the partner countries. Maybe Julia or even our colleagues from GIZ, if they are still online, want to comment on this as well.
Maybe I'll just add a couple of points, even though I think that largely covers it. In the Caribbean, as mentioned, and as Kira just again highlighted, there are some regional agreements that allow for freedom of movement, for partial freedom of movement, which means that in a lot of cases, in the disaster situation, people will move between countries without being recorded upon entry. And this is one thing that was repeatedly raised by our interview partners as something that created data gaps, especially when people then become sort of invisible in urban areas and with host families, rather than being counted in any kind of government center. This is something that would be difficult to address in a lot of ways, but that policymakers suggested some enhanced harmonization and standardization of platforms would be particularly useful, of data management platforms, and also some work on data collection methods. People also highlighted that there would be a strong need to better understand differences between the types of people that are moving. So there's quite a strong gap in terms of understanding gender differences, understanding how children are differently affected than adults, how LGBTQI communities are affected differently, and so on. So while in the Caribbean, perhaps there's some coordination occurring, there can also be a greater coordination between countries that don't have freedom of movement protocols in place. As we know in island states, because of the limited land availability and the likelihood that the whole island may be affected by an extreme storm, people may have to move across international boundaries, and this creates a whole new set of challenges in data collection. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Kira and Julia. That was quite insightful. Very useful. I'm turning over to the chat box now. I see it's actually from Kira. I see the first question to Damien. Has the transhumance data generated been picked up by the research community plus policy community? So Julia continues that. If there are any trends you notice that may inform changes.
Thanks. On the research point, we are collaborating at the moment with the remote sensing solution, which is a German company looking at satellite imagery detection. And so we're feeding their model, which is basically using satellite imageries to kind of do a monitoring of environmental related patterns of transhumance. The idea would be to kind of use whatever data we're able to bring in terms of flows, particularly, with different layers of satellite imageries in order to kind of identify and potentially even forecast the potential changes of corridors of transhumance throughout the time. So that's one ongoing thing. I'm happy to share some more about it. This is funded by the German Aerospace Institute, actually. On the policy side, it's interesting. I think the main strength of this project is actually that a lot of the data collection happening at the moment is done by a network of transhumants, which is called RBM, Réseau Bilitan Maobe, which is this massive network of associations of herders throughout West and Central Africa that are really well connected also at the ground level with a lot of key informants and local authorities, but also at the regional level with ECOWAS and whoever deals with transhumance policies. So this network, as well as ourselves, we will be in the next regional consultation for regional transhumance, which is supposed to happen in December, I think, in Lomé. And there is an expectation definitely in that meeting to kind of be able to come up with figures on who is going to, how many people and how many cattle are going to move southwards, how many are still stranded in southern coastal countries, and that will kind of help them define a little bit better their quotas in theory and the vaccination policies around that. So there's we don't have an example yet of it, but it's coming in the next few months, basically. But again, I think all of this is because we have that connection with this big network of transhumance associations.
Thank you, Damien. That's interesting. Next question is to Sylvant here. The IDMC report on internal displacement only considers sudden disaster, but what about slow onset? Is there a way to combine data for both? And how do you single out factor of climate migration from other reasons of migration? This is from Aryan Bai, Tata Institute of Social Science, India. Over to you, Sylvant.
Thank you for the question. The good news is since 2017, as soon as we have clear evidence about displacement due to slow onset, is also part of our global estimates. And this is something that is really difficult to find clear evidence about it. And we try really also to differentiate between the voluntary migration and the forced migration. And this is something that we also try to be very careful with. This is why we are giving like an estimate only on forced displacement due to slow onset, regardless if it is due to a drought or sea level rise or coastal erosion. And just to give you like another example regarding Afghanistan, our colleagues from IOM DTM also recently published a baseline report regarding the number of people that are living in situation of displacement in Afghanistan. And last year, we report that 1.2 million people were living in a situation of displacement due to multiple disasters, and the majority of them was due to the drought situation in Afghanistan. I hope it answers your questions.
Thanks, Sylvain. I hope that answers the question, Ariane. I saw Sylvain also posted a question to Susanna, but I think it's about the recent cyclones will be reflected in methodology. And I think she provided the answer there in the chat box. So I'm not going to repeat probably, but turning to Susanna, there was a question submitted by a few participants that register. They were asking if there's been, if we've observed any evidence from different countries in terms of how migrant returnees affected by COVID are moving towards agriculture or other type livelihoods with climate resilient reintegration. Yeah.
I'm not I'm not personally aware of the data. That would be what the returnees are doing when they're back in the country. I don't have information about that. The information that we have from the countries is what the countries are doing now, but we don't have that. The communities are doing. We don't have a particular information about returned migrants, what exactly they're doing, how they are incorporating themselves again into the community. We don't know. I am particularly don't know. I can find out if I have someone email to me. I can connect with the people in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador for more in the field information.
Just quick follow-up to that, but would you think that will also that will influence in terms of your research also this this particular population groups of returning migrants because of COVID restrictions in their wherever they were before?
I think that goes into the question that we have is how COVID-related effect, and that could be many different kinds of effects. So one of those is they cannot stay in the country or they decided to return, how that is affecting household livelihood that are based on migration. So you have the household relies on migrants going to different areas, to different labor markets, and that cannot happen anyway. How that altered the dynamic of the country. And I think one of the reasons we selected these countries is that for the macro level, this country has a very different reliance on remittances, for example, that is so much higher in Honduras and El Salvador, comparing, for example, to Guatemala. So that's part of what we want to see, how exactly the whole situation is altering the use of mobility as a response and as a strategy.
Thank you, Susanna. I'm going back to the chat box now. I see one question again to Damien from Philippe Carroll. Do you consider the conference de Bourgotière in Mali on transhumance route and pattern? Do you consider impact of climate change and drought on recovery of floodplain and food stock in those countries affecting transhumance route?
For the conference, we did not attend that one directly, but there's definitely associations that are linked with RBM that are attending that. So I could not tell more about it, but it's definitely something that the RBM and their network in Mali are part of on discussing. The impact of climate change and droughts on the changes of routes is not something. We're not looking exactly at that linkage in the data collection. So it would be hard to tell you there is a change because of that. However, it's something that we could potentially assess, I would say, by interviewing a bit more some of the transhumants that we're counting, for example, And this is something we're actually looking at doing in 2021 with some support from our environmental and climate change migration colleagues. To basically, yes, do some interviews to understand a little bit the changes in calendars over the years, the changing in route over the years, and in trying to understand the reason behind it. So right now, I could not really answer much of your question, but it's coming in 2021.
Okay, coming soon. Thank you, Damien. I'm going to turn back. I don't see more questions on the chat, so I'm going to turn back. There is also another question, and it probably goes to Julia and Kira again. What could be the role of local actors or civil society organizations in helping collecting data and evidence? I guess linked to your analysis on the policy landscape and frameworks.
Yeah, maybe the looking at the city administrative level, I think, is a very important actor to gather data and then to put it in a kind of form that is, first of all, digitalized, which is not always the case, and then that can be digested by other bodies. So there needs to be a further standardization of how, like what type of data we're trying to gather, and how that can be harmonized so it can be eventually aggregated to a larger level. And it's just important to emphasize that sometimes the resources on the ground, especially in the case of disasters, I mean, most of us are aware of this, but just to re-emphasize it, they're very, very limited, right? So it's very difficult to kind of demand then like excellent data gathering on people who are displaced when even like basic services to people are lacking. Of course, one then that kind of relates to the other. If you don't have data, then you don't know how many people you need to tailor towards your response systems. So it is a difficult subject and definitely requires like further capacity building on the local level, training people, further financing on the local level, because people who work in city administrations and such, they're really in touch with the people who are frontline affected. So I think that's very crucial to implement. And one could even think of possibilities of furthering this kind of citizen science projects into this arena where people themselves who have access to like cell phones or smartphones or other type of services could put down their data or their community's data. But of course, all of this has to be thought through very thoroughly, especially with regards to data protection and such.
Okay, thank you for that, Kira. Unless Julia wants to add anything.
No, I couldn't have said it better.
Thanks, thank you for that. We are getting closer to 3:30, which will be the end of our session. I don't see there is a comment from Philip again to Damien, but I think it's to discuss further.
Yep.
Perhaps before we close, I'm going to give 2 minutes for each of our presenters. If you have final remark, but along to that, I took note during the presentation. There's like there's a lot of mention about gaps and recommendations. There is one particular things that we hear every day. On one side, there are voices saying we have lots of data. We have even more data than we can chew. We should invest more on analysis capacity. On the other hand, there are voices saying, how can we do more and better analysis? We don't have any data. There's still big data gaps. And when we think about disaster, the topic of disaster displacement, what is your thought on this? Which one is correct, or both are correct? Your thought, and perhaps final remark before we close the session. I'll start with Julia and Kira.
Julia, why don't you go first?
Sure. Okay. So I think in the research that we presented today, one thing that we highlight is that there is occasionally a disconnect between the technical capacities at the national level as compared to where really the rubber meets the road in terms of implementation of policies. For example, in the Philippines, it's the local government units that really need to address disaster displacement, address integration of migrants, and so on. So I think what we would hope for in the future would be an increase of scientific literacy of these groups, which would likely mean coordinating better with academics at the more localized level, coordinating with technical experts, and of course, all of this requiring better funding sources and more clear funding sources that would improve not just the scientific literacy in terms of how to deal with migration data and displacement data, but also more generally about climate change and the impacts of climate change and improving an overall level of understanding of these phenomena. So that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, maybe just to add 2 sentences to that. I think an important aspect that Julia just raised is this scientific literacy on climate impact science, which is of course a high goal, but it's an important one because what we're seeing right now is also displacement of people who are not adapted well to the current climate, which is still like relatively stable. But before anything could get stabilized or better, we're definitely going to see more impacts emerge just because of the inertia of the Earth system. So we will see a lot more displacements over the coming decades if we are not able to better fortify against increasing climate impacts. So the pressure will definitely rise. The question is just how we will respond to it. And then for the latter half of the century demands the emissions reductions. But yeah, just to remind ourselves how important it is to really understand how climate impacts will emerge in local contexts and regions. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia and Kira. Susanna, perhaps your final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. I completely agree with Julia and Kira. I think that in addition to that, there are data about certain topics and for certain areas and groups, but not uniform across all geographies or all situations. So you have those gaps about specific issues and specific topics and how you coordinate these. And I also want to mention that one of the things that I was very impressed today was this idea that it's not only the data, it's how you evaluate that, how you use that, and the tools and platforms are critical, because if you need to integrate data coming from many different sources and many different areas, including climate, you need that tools and those platforms. It saves a lot of time and already provide access to the data. And I think that there is still a very important part in terms of research that is attribution. And a lot more work is about how you exactly attribute the effects of climate change or any kind of environmental factor to any kind of mobility. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. Damian, final thought?
Susanna, I kind of stole my point. I was going to make the same. To me, the main difficulty now that we have that we have now in collecting data on climate change and movement is that we don't yet really know how to measure it when we're doing an interview with someone. Like, how do you assess the impact of climate change on someone who's moved from the rural area to a city in Senegal? What's the part of climate change? What's the part of more of an economic reason? I think that's key it is key to kind of test a little bit more in the field the questions that would help us attribute at least partially climate change to a movement. And it's the same on displacement. I think in areas in Western Central Africa, Lake Chad or Lake Takogoma, where you have definitely the conflict as the main reason usually of migration or displacement, there are usually also reasons for movements linked with climate change. In the Lake Chad basin, it's clear that it's not only displacement linked to violence. So yeah, I think it's about trying to find in our data collection and in our research, how do we actually assess the role of climate change in the movement.
Thank you, Damien. Finally, Sylvain.
Yes, thank you, Rizky. Maybe in 2 words, what we really need is to really understand the duration of the displacement, is the time series. I think we have to come across like some standards among different organizations to see for how long, and of course with the support of government, for how long they should do like an assessment of people living in situation of displacement, because it will be key for us to assess this kind of duration. We need also to understand how long the reconstruction or the recovery will depend. As Susanna said, it's like very regional. Like maybe in Fiji, the reconstruction rate will be faster than any country in developed countries, because they have the community behind that can support other members to rebuild housing. Yes, I think the main key there is the main key points. It's like what I would love to see, it's really when the data points reach 0. And I think for the time being, it's almost unknown. It stopped maybe at 30,000, 10,000. But what is happening to these people that remain in situation? This is the unknown remaining question.
Okay, thank you, Sylvain. I would like to thank our presenters very much, Julia, Kira, Susanna, Damien, Sylvain, Kara also has left. Thank you very much for your presentation and your time. I would like to thank all the participants also for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We still have another session that will start in half an hour time from now, session number 3. There's going to be a few interesting presentations also. So stay tuned if you'd like to join that one. But for now, I say thank you very much, and I hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you.